We'll move on now to our last short presentation. Christina Greene will be presenting. Christina is a research assistant scientist for the climate assessment for the Southwest, CAMUS, at the University of Arizona. And with a doctorate in human geography, Christina's research focuses on the human dimensions of drought, climate vulnerability, resilience, and environmental knowledge. Christina,
thanks, Emily.
Great.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to do a big shift now and put our social scientist hats on. When we've entered this project, we've really tried to think about what does resilience mean for ranchers, and that's what kind of our entry into it. And resilience is a term that actually comes from the natural sciences and is being integrated into social sciences. And it's generally being defined as a capacity of the system to absorb disturbance and retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. However, a lot of social scientists have kind of taken issue with some of the more traditional application of resilience because people function very differently than plants. They're a lot messier, a lot more unpredictable. And they're dealing with things like power and agency and economics, and it's just very different, messy story. And so, in the social science literature, they've actually kind of pushed the term resilience a little bit further, and I'm not going to go into it, but there are a lot of arguments into what resilience means. And entering into this project, we were trying to understand what does resilience mean for ranchers? What are the threats that they are identifying? And how are they adapting or not adapting to these threats? And to approach this, we've kind of borrowed from some of the resilience theory and other in social science. And some of the critical questions are resilience of what to what, resilience for where, resilience for whom, resilience for when, and why should we be talking about resilience? Why is it important to be resilient? And in asking a lot of ranchers about their experiences, this first project is really starting to inform what ranchers understand is important is resilience of what to what and resilience for when. And so this project, we conducted focus groups and interviews in 7 different landscapes across the U.S., including Southern California, Nevada, Southern and Northern Utah, Arizona, Northeastern Colorado, and Western Nebraska. And we spoke in total with 52 ranchers and 12 land managers with the Forest Service or the BLM. And most of the people we spoke with had at least 20 years of experience in ranching, but not all. We did have some people who had less experience. And these landscapes actually represent a range of ranchers using both private and public land. And I just want to highlight that we are dealing with qualitative data here. We do not quantify any of these perceptions, but it's just it's ranchers speaking about their experience and perceptions of both threats and adaptations. And so in an analysis of all these interviews, we've identified 4 resilience themes. So 4 sets of challenges and adaptations. One, resilience to changing ecological conditions. The second, the struggle to maintain economic resilience. The aspiration to keep ranch and communities resilient for the future. And then resilience in face of competing demands on land. And so when we're thinking about those 5, the 5 W's of resilience, we're kind of approaching here the first one, resilience to what? The second theme also informs resilience to what? The third theme informs resilience for when. And the fourth one, resilience to what and for whom. And so the first thing that really stood out was the resilience to changing ecological conditions. And how are ranchers responding to weather variability? And drought and climate were constantly identified as a major challenge to ranching, not just drought alone, but so one instance, one rancher spoke about one year when they had an incredible drought and all of her cattle were pretty weakened and they didn't have a lot of meat on their bones. And then they had a big snowstorm come through and then the cattle just couldn't put up with it anymore. And she lost a lot of cattle during that event. And so when we talked about precipitation, the timing of precipitation was also a big theme. It's not that you could hit a monsoon, but if it rained all at once in over 1 week, as opposed to consistently throughout the monsoon period, that was a very difficult event to adapt to. There are other ecological conditions that ranchers spoke about as a threat: invasive species like cheatgrass, also dealing with fire, were events that were that ranchers identified as threats to the future of ranching. And ranchers did speak of quite a lot of different tools that they used to adapt to these conditions. Understocking was consistently identified as a major adaptation. The putting in wells and water pipelines, changing how they managed grazing was discussed, changing cattle genetics, improving it, buying hay and feed during the drought. And these were all the different tools that ranchers were able to speak about. And there was differences on whether people were on private or public land, and that really modified how people were able to adapt to these events. And especially on public land, a lot of ranchers felt that regulations and the grazing plans put on by the public agencies were really restricting their ability to adapt. And so I want to, kind of drill into one case, and that has to do with putting in wells and water pipelines for cattle, which was consistently identified as a great way to improve resilience in drought. And the first quote here from a rancher in Nevada, he says, "Well, we're almost all well watered down in our allotments, very few springs and creeks, and the state of Nevada fights with the BLM over water rights, and we're in the middle. And it's really hard to drill. It's expensive to drill a well anyway, but the red tape you have to go through to get permission to drill a well from the BLM, and then through the state also, it takes a long time. And in many cases, ranchers spoke of it taking 5 to 10 years to get NEPA approval to put in these wells." And then we also have a story from a rancher in Arizona who was able to partner with wildlife groups to put in some water into their public land allotment. And he says, "I've got a solar pump. Who would have thought I'd put a solar pump on a windmill? It's been there since the late 1800s. But that's pretty cool because when I run out of water, I've got feed, and now I've got permanent water. Anyone else been down? I've got more deer, I've got more dove, I've got more pigs, I've got more wildlife than I had before, directly as a result of someone willing to help me and help the land." And so, here we've kind of got, they're both on public land, both ranchers, and we've got two different examples of how people have been able to adapt or not adapt using water infrastructure. So the second theme we identified was a struggle to maintain economic resilience. And it basically depicts the everyday struggle to keep the ranch afloat. We mainly spoke with small ranchers, and we did however, speak with one very large ranching operation that served kind of as a contrast to the economic struggles that ranchers are going on a day-to-day basis. And the picture that emerged is that ranching is really not a self-sustaining activity at the family scale, and it's often subsidized by other income. The economic pressures that were identified, including the rising prices of inputs, people complained about how tractors are far more expensive now proportionally than they were 20, 30 years ago. High labor costs, ranchers have to understock not only because of the land, but because they just can't pay for the labor involved in keeping more cattle on the land. The increase in consolidation of power of meat packers and how they've influenced beef prices was a big theme. And the volatility of international markets. And ranchers felt like they had no say in setting prices. They were at the will of a larger economic system that they weren't able to influence. And so to adapt to this, most ranchers diversified into other economic sources, and many of them had off-farm income. Other adaptations were improving beef quality so that they could get higher prices on the market, specializing in organic beef, or just downsizing to manage costs. And we have some really great quotes that depict his frustration to just stay out of the red. So here we have a rancher from northern Utah. In the past with the cattle, years ago, before the video auction, you pretty well sold all of your animals. But because of the video auction with the cattle now, we have to sell in semi-load lots. And that becomes a challenge. I played with everything to try to get my cattle to where I think it will work. And it's a challenge just to make this. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Another rancher in Colorado spoke about the cattle market and how it's shifting, short-term trends and long-term trends, and how you plan for that. The more I learn about the cattle market, the more I realize how it's just like Russian roulette in the cattle business. And when speaking to the 2 federal managers in southern Utah, they identified that out of their 125 ranchers on public land allotments, only 2 of them were doing it full time, and everyone else had another income. Either wife was a teacher in town, or there were really a lot of people who were just ranching on the weekends. And I just can't, I keep thinking about that one sentence from the rancher. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And that kind of really feeds into our third theme that we've identified. And these are aspirations to keep the ranching community resilient for the future. And a lot of ranchers were really worried about the long-term success of their ranch. A lot of them came from multi-generational families, and they were 3rd, 4th generation, and they wanted to see that ranching business survive. And this is on both public and private land. And they were concerned that the fact that the drought and the ranching economics just made it too hard. It just really wasn't worth the squeeze for their children. In places like Southern California, the rising cost of land was a pressure as they saw that children thought it was better to just sell the land and take the money than try to battle the everyday difficulty of being a rancher. And there were some ways that ranchers were adapting to this threat, and that included family transition planning. Often they said, well, my children don't want to be ranchers, but I've identified a grandchild that does. Or, no longer are they only looking to their sons to be ranchers, but some people are looking at their daughters to be ranchers, or their nephew or niece. In California, a lot of the ranchers spoke about creating conservation easements on their land to kind of give it some stability and have something that was going to stay together for the next generation. And so in this issue of succession, here a rancher in Southern California says, a lot of these big ranches were put together by grandparents and great-grandparents. I see a real problem with keeping these ranches intact generationally. You've got a bunch of kids, you've got all of a sudden a bunch of owners, and they're urban people, and they see a big investment in that real estate. And they don't see much of an investment coming back from the sale of cattle. So they say, what are you doing, Dad? We need to sell this place. We can do better with real estate. So I see that as a problem in agriculture as time goes by. How do we get away from that? I don't know. And with a little bit more of a positive side, in some places where we conducted our interviews, a lot of the ranchers seemed really negative and really kind of depressed about this issue of who's going to take the ranching up after us. And in some places, we've seen some ranchers who are more positive about the future. And they found ways to kind of bring some stability into the ranching business. And so here a rancher from Nebraska describes it as, I've got to be able to make it someplace that my kids want to be, my wife wants to be, and so I can't be working. I mean, I'd love to be working on that ranch 100% of the time. I went to work at an insurance agency, not so much as I needed a job, but it's in the works for me to buy the agency. Yeah, it diversifies things and gives it a little bit more stability. I've got 2 kids. I want them both to have something to stick around for. I think that's one thing we've done a poor job in rural America, is trying to promote our kids to stay. And this was a problem that was discussed on both private and public land. A lot of ranchers seem to pass down their public lawn allotments to their children, and it kind of stays within the family. And it just really identifies how ranching is not only an economic business, but it's an identity. It's an identity that they've inherited from their grandparents. It's a relationship with their land that they really want to pass on, that they value, and a lot of them see their children no longer valuing it, because often, they describe it as the juice not being worth the squeeze. And so the fourth theme that we've identified, the fourth set of challenges and adaptations, has to do with how ranchers are adapting to political, cultural, and economic changes that are creating more competing interests on land, and how range is used. This is both private and public. Basically, there are more people and more eyes on the range. And some of the threats in this theme include urban development, economic competition over land and water. So for Southern California, a lot of vineyards have been coming in, and a lot of ranchers were really worried with the rise of weed production in California. And it just makes land prices so astronomical that they aren't able to stay there anymore. Recreation on public land was consistently a big concern that was raised. A lot of fences are being destroyed by off-road vehicles and hunters, and they say this is a big change over the past 20 years. Ranchers spoke about a difference in how millennials saw public land. They want to be out there, and they want to be hiking, and they want to be using that land, and they see it as theirs. And having to share that space with other people is something that they're having to adapt to. And there were not a lot of adaptations discussed by ranchers and how to deal with these competing demands on land. A couple ranchers did speak about, going out into the general community and educating people on ranching and the importance of the food system. Some ranchers did collaborate with some nonprofits and environmental groups, but generally, a lot of ranchers were, kind of like, so I don't know what to do here. And so some of the quotes on this. So this rancher in southern Utah, she said, I feel like there's almost a negative view against ranchers, Westerns. When you had your old cowboy days and stuff, the West was this romantic place. I think that has shifted a little bit to not be so great. We grew up watching John Wayne movies and stuff like that. And they don't do that now. And so the perception of younger people is looking a different direction. And so that romance of the Western beef is not quite so much. We're just the people who run cows on and destroy the land. And here in this instance, the rancher was really frustrated because a lot of hikers were coming into her public lawn allotment and were destroying fences and were seeing her as someone who had a negative relationship with the range. And she was very frustrated with that because she thought she had a very positive one, and she saw herself as a steward. And she really noticed a social change across the country. And the next quote here is from a federal land manager in Colorado. Even in the last 5 years, our office has received a lot more just general inquiries, even in the form of official inquiries through the FOIA process of how are you grazing? When are you grazing? Where are you grazing? What's happening with the birds? Why do we have stock tanks? Why can't we just target shoot everywhere? Just an increased interest in how it's used, not necessarily in a negative light. But I think in the future, moving forward, there's got to be more people that are looking at how ranching is conducted out there, and that could change for better or for worse. I think maybe for better, how ranching is conducted on federal land out there. And we've kind of titled this theme, Cattle is No Longer King. And it's just this perception that ranchers have that they used to be more important, that they used to be valued. And not only this is, just generally from people coming into the public land, but also how public agencies are interacting with them. They spoke about the fact that it used to be that range officers within BLM and Forest Service, it was more of a coveted position, and they had more funding. And they've even noticed how funding has decreased for land management, and that they've seen that trickle down, and they're not being valued anymore, not only by people, but also by public agencies. And so looking at these themes, what does resilience mean for ranchers? And ranchers are trying to adapt to multiple interconnected social and ecological threats. When we first started doing analysis of this study, we tried to separate out the social and the ecological and look at them differently, and then try to link them up by each part. And that became an incredibly difficult and frustrating process. And we've really come to kind of treat it together, that you can't really separate out the social and ecological. They're deeply intertwined. And also each theme is intertwined. So, for example, the problems with the economics of it influence succession. And so when ranchers are adapting to the future and are they trying to become resilient, they have to be resilient to all of these things at once. They can't do one and then the other. And private and public land. So each theme we identified applies to both private and public, but they look very different. So adaptation options on public and private land are different, and yet both ranchers on both private and public land are dealing with these problems. And the resilience timeline, I think, was a strong issue that when we were looking at the analysis of it. Often we're trying to think, how do you be resilient to drought, and how do you survive season to season? But that's not how ranchers are looking at this. They're looking at how to survive the long term, and not only their life, but how does the ranch survive for their children? And so the resilience for when is a very long timeline, and not how do you survive year to year. And ranching is really a lot of ranchers are really not doing this for the money. And so resilience for them is not being the most profitable. They're doing this as a cultural identity. And so that's really what has to be resilient. Not so much are they surviving year to year, but that still feeds into the process. And kind of the question, the kind of takeaway question is, do ranchers have the capacity to adapt to all of these threats? And they've definitely identified a lot of tools for adapting to changing ecological conditions, but there are not a lot of tools identified for dealing with succession or dealing with a lot of other people wanting to use the range in different ways. And kind of the question that we need to take away and think about is, what does ranching look like to be resilient in the future, and how does it adapt to all of these themes at the same time?